She was always there, until the night no one noticed she stopped coming. The grand pack hall of the Whitmore territory shimmered under crystal chandeliers that stretched across the vaulted ceiling like frozen starlight, casting golden reflections onto marble floors polished to perfection for the elite gathering of alpha lineage families. Every conversation carried weight, every glance carried hierarchy, and every presence in the room was carefully measured by influence rather than intention. At the center of it all stood Grayson Whitmore, the Alpha King, surrounded by advisors, heirs, and strategic alliances that shaped the political balance of the entire region. Yet his attention rarely lingered on anything outside immediate governance. Somewhere near the outer edge of the hall stood Emma Collins, an Omega whose presence had become so consistent over the past 3 years that it blended into the structure of the pack itself, neither acknowledged nor formally dismissed. Simply existing in the space between recognition and invisibility, she stood with calm stillness, her hands lightly clasped, her gaze lowered just enough to avoid drawing attention, though her awareness of everything in the room remained sharp and precise, like someone who had learned to observe without permission. Across multiple pack balls, she had appeared in the same way, always arriving on time, always positioned at the periphery, always offering quiet respect to a system that never once turned toward her with acknowledgement. Grayson Whitmore had seen her before, or rather, had registered her presence without assigning importance to it, the way one notices background movement without attaching meaning. The beta advisor Daniel Hayes once mentioned her name in passing during a logistical report, but even that moment dissolved quickly beneath more pressing matters of alliance and governance. The pack balls themselves were designed to reinforce unity and power structure. Yet within their elegant order existed an unspoken hierarchy that determined who belonged at the center of attention and who remained at the edge of existence. Emma Collins had never complained, never disrupted, never demanded visibility. And over time her silence became part of the rhythm of these gatherings, like a detail the mind accepted without question. But something subtle began to shift in her over the course of the 3rd year, not in appearance or behavior, but in presence itself, as if the space she occupied no longer carried the same emotional weight it once did. She still attended each pack ball, still followed the same quiet routines, still maintained the same respectful distance. Yet there was a growing emptiness in the way she stood, as though a part of her had begun to withdraw long before anyone noticed. Even the servants who passed her by no longer offered the small nods of recognition they once gave out of habit, as if her existence had slowly faded into procedural assumption rather than acknowledged reality. Grayson Whitmore, meanwhile, continued his uninterrupted progression through political discussions, unaware that the Omega who had once been a constant peripheral presence was beginning to drift beyond the boundaries of visibility. No dramatic moment marked the change, no argument, no confrontation, no announcement, only the quiet erosion of attention until presence became indistinguishable from absence. And within that silent transformation, the foundation of everything the pack believed stable began to shift in ways no one yet understood. Because sometimes the most powerful change in a system is not what arrives, but what quietly stops coming. The second Grand Pack Ball of the season arrived with the same architectural perfection as the one before it. Yet something beneath its polished surface had already begun to feel subtly misaligned, as if the structure of celebration was intact, but the emotional resonance inside it had started to thin. Crystal chandeliers still cast their golden refractions across the marble hall. Music still flowed through elevated chambers with practiced elegance, and the hierarchy of alpha families still positioned itself according to established influence. But within this carefully maintained order, Emma Collins stood once again at the outer boundary of visibility, where presence existed without acknowledgement. Grayson Whitmore moved through the central gathering space as he always did, engaged in structured conversation with advisors and visiting alpha representatives, his attention divided between governance matters and alliance maintenance, never lingering long enough on peripheral details to register emotional irregularities within the crowd. Emma remained in her habitual position, quiet, composed, observant, her hands lightly folded as she tracked movement across the room with calm precision, never stepping forward, never interrupting the flow of higher-ranked interactions, always maintaining the distance that had defined her role for 3 years without deviation. Yet tonight, a subtle difference existed, not in her actions, but in her absence of internal reaction, as if something within her had already begun to detach from the rhythm of the pack itself. Conversations passed her without acknowledgement. Glances slid over her without recognition, and even those who once exchanged brief courtesy gestures now moved as if she were part of the architectural background rather than a living presence within the hall. Daniel Hayes, the beta advisor, noticed her position briefly during a rotation of administrative updates, but the observation ended as quickly as it formed, replaced by immediate focus on logistical coordination with alpha delegates. The system of pack balls had always functioned as both social reinforcement and hierarchical validation, ensuring that visibility equaled relevance. Yet Emma Collins had long existed in the lowest threshold of that system, neither rejected nor embraced, simply unmarked. What no one consciously recorded was how consistently she had maintained attendance, how predictably she had appeared at every formal gathering, how her presence had become a silent constant embedded within the structure of expectation. But constants, when removed, often reveal their importance only through the absence they leave behind. And on this night, that absence had not yet fully manifested, only begun to form as a subtle gap in the rhythm of recognition. Grayson Whitmore continued his movement through strategic dialogue, unaware that the Omega who had once occupied the farthest edge of his peripheral awareness was no longer emotionally reinforcing the background structure of these gatherings. There was no single moment that defined the shift, no visible departure, no confrontation, no announcement of withdrawal, only a gradual thinning of attention that no one had been trained to perceive as significant. Emma stood as she always had. Yet something about her stillness now carried a different quality, less like waiting and more like release, as if the act of being present no longer required internal investment. Across the hall, laughter rose from clusters of alpha families. Music transitioned into a softer interlude, and the pack ball continued its structured progression without interruption, completely unaware that one of its most consistent peripheral presences was beginning to fade not physically, but perceptually, slipping slowly toward a state where existence would no longer be reinforced by the attention of the world around her. The third pack ball of the season unfolded under the same luminous grandeur that defined all Whitmore territory gatherings. Yet beneath its structured elegance, a subtle emotional imbalance had begun to form, one that no formal system of hierarchy had been programmed to detect. Crystal lighting still reflected across polished marble floors, orchestral arrangements still guided conversation flow across designated social clusters, and alpha families still moved through established pathways of influence and recognition. But within this controlled environment, Emma Collins stood once again at the periphery, her presence no longer acknowledged even at the minimal level it had once received. Grayson Whitmore entered the central chamber space with the same composed authority as before, engaging in structured dialogue with advisors and visiting delegates. His attention distributed across governance discussions and alliance confirmations, never once deviating toward the outer boundary, where Omega presence typically remained unnoticed. Emma remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze calm and observant. But something in her internal rhythm had shifted, as if repetition itself had begun to lose meaning rather than endurance. Conversations passed through the hall in layered sequences of political exchange and social reinforcement, yet none of them intersected with her position anymore, not even at the level of incidental acknowledgement. Daniel Hayes, while reviewing attendance metrics for ceremonial protocol validation, briefly noted an irregular absence of standard Omega engagement responses tied to her usual presence zone, but the observation was immediately deprioritized within higher-level administrative priorities. What had once been a consistent pattern of quiet existence was now becoming a pattern of non-recognition, as though the system itself had begun to stop indexing her presence in real time. Emma had not changed her position, nor her behavior, nor her timing of attendance. Yet the environment around her had begun to behave as if she was no longer part of its active structure. Across the hall, Grayson Whitmore paused momentarily during a conversation, not because of awareness of her absence, but due to a brief disruption in conversational flow that resolved itself before conscious recognition could form, leaving no trace of concern or inquiry behind. Emma's stillness deepened, not in sadness or resistance, but in a quiet withdrawal that existed beneath perception, as if the effort of being socially registered had gradually become unnecessary. She no longer adjusted her posture in response to movement around her, no longer tracked conversational shifts with the same attentiveness, and no longer reinforced her own presence through subtle behavioral signaling that once marked her existence within the room. Instead, she remained anchored only in observation, detached from the expectation of recognition, existing at the threshold where visibility and absence began to overlap. The pack ball continued in full operation, music rising and falling through structured intervals, conversations layering across tiers of influence. Yet within this continuity, a single absence was forming that no one had yet consciously registered as meaningful. Emma Collins did not leave. She did not announce withdrawal. She did not disrupt the system. She simply ceased, reinforcing her existence within it. And in doing so, began the quiet transformation that would eventually shift the balance of everything the Alpha King believed remained stable within his world. The fourth pack ball unfolded under the same golden architectural brilliance of the Whitmore Territory Hall, yet the atmosphere had begun to carry an unfamiliar tension that was not caused by conflict, but by absence, as if something essential to the emotional structure of the gathering had quietly been removed without anyone formally acknowledging it. Crystal chandeliers continued to cast warm reflections across polished marble floors, and orchestral arrangements still guided the rhythm of conversation among alpha families and ranked delegates. But within this structured environment, Emma Collins was no longer positioned as a visible peripheral presence in the same way she had been for years. She was still physically present within the hall, standing at the outer boundary of the gathering space. Yet the social recognition that once subtly acknowledged her existence had now diminished to a point where even habitual peripheral awareness no longer activated in those passing nearby. Grayson Whitmore moved through the central space with composed authority, engaged in structured dialogue regarding territory coordination and alliance stability. His attention fully embedded in governance dynamics without deviation toward peripheral observation, as if the environment itself no longer contained any unresolved irregularity requiring personal notice. Emma remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression calm and unreadable, yet there was a noticeable shift in how she occupied space, not physically but perceptually, as though the environment was no longer reinforcing her presence through reciprocal attention loops that typically sustain social visibility within pack hierarchy systems. Daniel Hayes, reviewing attendance and protocol alignment from a secondary observation station, briefly flagged an inconsistency in Omega participation feedback metrics, noting that Emma Collins had attended consecutively across multiple cycles but had not generated any corresponding social acknowledgement responses within the hall structure, a deviation that remained unclassified but recorded under passive anomaly observation. Across the hall, conversations continued in layered progression, yet none intersected with Emma's position, not even at the level of incidental reference. And even those who had previously shared brief acknowledgement gestures now moved past her without perceptual engagement, as if the cognitive recognition threshold required for social indexing had gradually ceased to activate in relation to her presence. Grayson Whitmore paused briefly during a transitional moment in conversation, not due to awareness of absence, but because of a minor disruption in conversational flow that resolved instantly, leaving no conscious trace of inquiry or attention redirection. Emma Collins, however, remained in place longer than she had in previous cycles, not because she was waiting, but because the internal expectation of being noticed had already diminished to a point where its absence no longer produced emotional response. Her stillness now carried a different structural quality, one that no longer participated in the rhythm of the pack ball, but existed adjacent to it, like a silent coordinate outside the system of recognition. The hall continued its ceremonial progression uninterrupted, music rising and falling in controlled sequences, conversations maintaining hierarchical order. Yet within this continuity, Emma Collins had transitioned from being an overlooked presence to something closer to an unindexed variable within the social structure. She did not announce departure. She did not alter behavior, and she did not resist the environment around her. She simply continued to exist without reinforcement from the system that once registered her presence at the lowest threshold of awareness, and in doing so, created the first measurable gap in the pack's emotional continuity that no one had yet realized was forming. The fifth pack ball unfolded with the same architectural precision as the previous gatherings. Yet the emotional structure of the Whitmore Territory Hall had begun to show subtle signs of destabilization that were not reflected in any official system reports, as if the social framework itself was continuing its functions while quietly losing one of its foundational reference points. Crystal chandeliers still illuminated the vast marble hall with warm golden light, and orchestral music continued to guide the rhythm of conversation between alpha families and ranked delegates. Yet within this carefully maintained order, Emma Collins no longer functioned as a recognized peripheral presence within the social indexing system of the pack. She stood at the same outer boundary of the hall where she had always been positioned. But now even the minimal acknowledgement loops that once registered her existence in passing awareness had diminished to near absence, creating a perceptual silence around her that extended beyond physical space. Grayson Whitmore moved through the central chamber with structured composure, engaged in governance discussions and territorial coordination strategy, his attention fully allocated to leadership responsibilities without deviation toward peripheral observation, as if the hall itself had resolved any previously unnoticed irregularities without requiring conscious intervention. Emma remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression calm and composed. Yet her presence now carried a structural discontinuity, as though the system that once reinforced her visibility through habitual recognition cycles had begun to fail in maintaining her as an indexed participant within the pack's social architecture. Daniel Hayes, monitoring protocol stability from an elevated observation position, noted a progressive deviation in omega presence recognition metrics, where Emma Collins continued to appear physically within all scheduled pack ball events, but no longer triggered corresponding acknowledgement responses in either social or hierarchical interaction layers. A condition recorded as passive visibility degradation without assigned causation. Across the hall, conversations flowed without interruption, but none intersected with Emma's position, not even an incidental reference, and even individuals who had previously demonstrated minimal awareness of her presence now moved through her vicinity as if she no longer occupied a cognitively registered space within their perception field. Grayson Whitmore briefly paused during a transition between strategic discussions, but the pause was procedural rather than perceptual, resolving immediately without cognitive attribution or emotional recognition, leaving no residual awareness of environmental change. Emma Collins, however, did not adjust her position or attempt to re-establish visibility through any behavioral reinforcement, instead remaining in a state of complete observational stillness, where her existence no longer relied on external validation loops that previously sustained minimal recognition within the pack structure. The hall continued its ceremonial progression with unchanged precision, music maintaining its structured cadence, conversations continuing in hierarchical alignment. Yet within this continuity, Emma Collins had fully transitioned into a state of non-indexed presence, where physical existence persisted without corresponding social acknowledgement within the system's recognition framework. No announcement marked this transition, no event triggered it, and no participant within the hall registered it as significant. Yet within the underlying structure of the pack ball system, a foundational element of emotional and perceptual continuity had begun to quietly dissolve without detection, creating a gap that remained unrecognized even as it continued to expand across successive cycles of gathering. The seventh pack ball unfolded with the same formal precision as the previous gatherings, yet the structural integrity of the event had begun to reveal a subtle but measurable distortion in its social recognition framework, as if the system responsible for maintaining hierarchical awareness was continuing to function externally, while internally failing to register a specific point of existence within its perceptual mapping. Crystal chandeliers still illuminated the vast Whitmore Hall with controlled golden radiance, and orchestral music still dictated the rhythm of movement and conversation among alpha families and territorial delegates, but within this maintained order. Emma Collins had fully transitioned beyond the threshold of active recognition within the pack's cognitive and social indexing systems. She stood at the farthest boundary of the hall as she had in previous cycles, maintaining the same calm and composed posture. Yet now even the residual awareness that once occasionally acknowledged her presence in peripheral observation had completely dissolved, leaving no trace of social reinforcement or environmental acknowledgement directed toward her. Position: Grayson Whitmore moved through the central chamber with structured authority, engaged in governance coordination and alliance reinforcement discussions, his attention fully integrated within leadership responsibilities, no longer exhibiting any deviation toward peripheral environmental zones where Omega presence had once existed as a background constant within the system's social architecture. Emma remained motionless, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, but her presence now functioned entirely outside the active recognition loop of the pack hierarchy, creating a condition where physical existence and social perception no longer intersected at any operational level within the gathering space. Daniel Hayes, reviewing live system integrity and attendance verification protocols from the secondary observation interface, recorded a continued and now stabilized degradation in Omega visibility indexing, where Emma Collins maintained complete physical compliance across all scheduled pack ball cycles, but generated no corresponding acknowledgement signatures within social interaction tracking, perceptual reinforcement layers, or hierarchical engagement systems, resulting in formal classification as persistent non-indexed presence under advanced deviation monitoring protocols. Across the hall, structured conversations and ceremonial exchanges continued without disruption. Yet none intersected with Emma's position in any cognitive or perceptual capacity, and even individuals previously positioned near her trajectory now moved through her vicinity without any recognition response activation, as though her presence had been fully decoupled from environmental awareness. Processing: Grayson Whitmore briefly shifted position during a transition between strategic dialogue exchanges, but the movement carried no perceptual deviation or acknowledgement trigger, resolving instantly within the flow of governance interaction without registering environmental irregularity. Emma Collins, however, remained in complete observational stillness, no longer reinforcing her presence through any behavioral or attentional signals that might previously have sustained minimal recognition within the hierarchical system, instead existing in a state where presence no longer required validation or response from surrounding structures. The hall continued its ceremonial progression with unchanged precision, music maintaining structured cadence, conversations flowing across designated hierarchy tiers, yet within this continuity, Emma Collins had fully transitioned into a permanently non-indexed state of existence within the pack's perceptual framework, where physical presence remained intact but entirely disconnected from the cognitive systems responsible for recognition, acknowledgement, or social reinforcement. No participant within the hall registered this transition, no formal system flagged it as critical, and no deviation alerts were generated. Yet within the underlying structure of the pack ball environment, a complete perceptual void had formed around a single point of existence that continued to occupy space without being seen, acknowledged, or cognitively reinforced by any operational layer of the social hierarchy, marking the full completion of her silent withdrawal from the world that once consistently ignored her presence but had now progressed into complete non-perception. The eighth pack ball unfolded under the same architectural grandeur that had defined every Whitmore territory gathering. Yet the structural logic of the event had begun to exhibit a deeper and more irreversible distortion within its perceptual recognition framework, as if the system responsible for social indexing was continuing to operate in full external functionality while internally failing to register a specific point of existence that had once been consistently embedded within its awareness architecture. Crystal chandeliers still cast controlled golden light across the vast marble hall, and orchestral arrangements still guided the structured flow of conversation among alpha families and territorial delegates. Yet within this maintained ceremonial order, Emma Collins had fully transitioned beyond all operational thresholds of recognition, no longer functioning even as a peripheral or background variable within the pack's cognitive mapping system. She stood at the same outer boundary of the hall as in previous cycles, maintaining unchanged posture and composure. Yet now even the residual fragments of awareness that once intermittently registered her presence had completely collapsed, leaving no perceptual reinforcement, no cognitive acknowledgement, and no social indexing response directed toward her existence. Grayson Whitmore moved through the central chamber with composed authority, engaged in structured governance dialogue and alliance. Reinforcement strategy, his attention fully absorbed within leadership responsibilities, exhibiting no deviation toward peripheral zones where Omega presence had once existed as a low-priority background constant within the hierarchical awareness structure. Emma remained completely still, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. But her presence now existed entirely outside the operational recognition loop of the pack system, creating a condition where physical existence no longer generated any corresponding perceptual or cognitive validation within the social environment. Daniel Hayes, reviewing live system integrity logs and hierarchical awareness calibration metrics from the secondary observation interface, recorded a complete stabilization of Omega visibility degradation patterns, where Emma Collins maintained full physical attendance compliance across all scheduled pack ball cycles, yet generated zero recognition signatures across all active social, perceptual, and hierarchical indexing layers, resulting in formal classification as absolute non-indexed presence under advanced systemic deviation protocols. Across the hall, structured conversations and ceremonial exchanges continued without interruption, yet none intersected with Emma's position in any cognitive, perceptual, or attentional capacity, and even individuals previously positioned near her trajectory now moved through her vicinity without any awareness activation, as though her existence had been fully removed from environmental processing architecture despite remaining physically present within the space. Grayson Whitmore briefly adjusted his position during a transition between governance discussions, but the movement carried no perceptual deviation or recognition trigger, resolving instantly within the flow of structured interaction without any cognitive acknowledgement of environmental irregularity. Emma Collins, however, remained in complete observational stillness, no longer reinforcing her presence through any behavioral, emotional, or attentional signaling mechanisms that might previously have sustained minimal recognition within the hierarchical system, instead existing in a state where presence no longer required validation, response, or acknowledgement from any surrounding structure. The hall continued its ceremonial progression with unchanged precision, music maintaining structured cadence, conversations flowing across designated hierarchy tiers. Yet within this continuity, Emma Collins had fully transitioned into a permanently unregistered state of existence within the pack's perceptual framework, where physical presence remained intact but entirely disconnected from all cognitive systems responsible for recognition, awareness, or social reinforcement. No participant within the hall registered this transition, no formal system flagged it as anomalous, and no deviation alerts were generated. Yet within the underlying architecture of the pack ball environment, a complete and irreversible perceptual void had formed around a single persistent point of existence that continued to occupy physical space without being seen, acknowledged, or cognitively reinforced by any operational layer of the social hierarchy, marking the final stabilization of her silent disappearance from a world that had not expelled her, but had instead progressed beyond the ability to perceive her at all. The ninth pack ball unfolded under the same ceremonial architecture that had defined every Whitmore territory gathering. Yet the underlying perceptual framework of the event had now entered a final and irreversible phase of structural disconnection, as if the system responsible for social recognition had completed its gradual failure sequence and reached a state where one persistent point of physical existence could no longer be indexed under any active cognitive layer. Crystal chandeliers continued to cast controlled golden illumination across the vast marble hall, and orchestral arrangements still guided the formal rhythm of conversation among alpha families and territorial delegates. Yet within this unchanged external order, Emma Collins no longer existed within any operational recognition pathway of the pack's awareness system, not even as residual background data or peripheral environmental noise. She stood at the same outer boundary of the hall where she had always been positioned across all previous cycles, maintaining identical posture, identical composure, identical stillness. Yet now even the final remnants of incidental awareness that once intermittently registered her presence had fully collapsed into complete perceptual nullification, leaving no cognitive, social, or hierarchical acknowledgement layer capable of interacting with her existence. Grayson Whitmore moved through the central chamber with composed authority, engaged in structured governance dialogue and alliance continuity management, his attention fully integrated within leadership responsibilities, exhibiting no deviation, no interruption, and no residual perceptual feedback toward peripheral zones where Omega presence had once existed as a background constant within the pack's hierarchical structure. Emma remained entirely motionless, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. But her existence now functioned entirely outside all recognition frameworks, creating a condition where physical presence no longer generated any response, reaction, or validation within the surrounding social environment, effectively decoupling her from all perceptual systems while leaving her bodily continuity intact. Daniel Hayes, reviewing live system integrity logs and hierarchical awareness calibration metrics from the secondary observation interface, recorded a complete and stabilized failure of Omega visibility indexing across all operational layers, confirming that Emma Collins maintained full physical attendance compliance across all scheduled packball cycles while generating absolute zero recognition signatures across social interaction tracking, perceptual reinforcement systems, and hierarchical engagement matrices, resulting in formal classification as fully non-indexed persistent presence under advanced systemic nullification protocol. Across the hall, structured conversations and ceremonial exchanges continued without interruption or deviation, yet none intersected with Emma's position in any cognitive, perceptual, or attentional capacity. And even individuals previously positioned within close proximity trajectory now moved through her vicinity without any awareness activation, as though her existence had been fully removed from environmental processing architecture while remaining physically embedded within the space. Grayson Whitmore briefly adjusted his position during a transition between governance discussions, but the movement carried no perceptual deviation, no recognition trigger, and no cognitive interruption, resolving instantly within the continuous flow of structured interaction without any acknowledgement of environmental irregularity or missing presence. Emma Collins, however, remained in complete and final observational stillness, no longer reinforcing her presence through any behavioral, emotional, or attentional mechanism, no longer participating in any recognition feedback loop, and no longer existing within any system capable of registering her existence. Instead, occupying a state of absolute perceptual discontinuity where physical presence persisted without any corresponding cognitive existence within the packs. Operational reality. The hall continued its ceremonial progression with unchanged precision, music maintaining structured cadence, conversations flowing across designated hierarchy tiers, yet within this continuity, Emma Collins had fully transitioned beyond all forms of recognition, indexing, and awareness, reaching a final state where she was no longer ignored, no longer overlooked, but entirely unperceived by the world that had once consistently failed to notice her, and now no longer had the capacity to see her at all. The 10th pack ball unfolded under the same ceremonial architecture that had defined every Whitmore territory gathering, yet the underlying perceptual system that once maintained structured recognition across all social tiers had now reached a critical state of complete disconnection, as if a single missing reference point had caused a cascading failure in the emotional indexing framework that sustained the pack's collective awareness. Crystal chandeliers still illuminated the vast marble hall with controlled golden radiance, and orchestral arrangements still guided the structured rhythm of conversation among alpha families and territorial delegates. But within this unchanged external order, Emma Collins no longer existed in any form of cognitive, social, or perceptual registration, not even as absence, but as something entirely outside the system's ability to define. She stood at the same outer boundary of the hall where she had always been positioned, maintaining identical posture and composure. Yet now even the concept of being overlooked no longer applied, because there was no longer any mechanism within the pack's awareness architecture capable of referencing her existence at all. Grayson Whitmore moved through the central chamber with composed authority, engaged in structured governance dialogue and alliance continuity management, his attention fully absorbed within leadership responsibilities. Yet for the first time within recorded cycles, a subtle inconsistency began to emerge within the broader emotional structure of the event, not directed, not recognized, but experienced as a faint discontinuity in the expected rhythm of presence and interaction. Conversations continued in hierarchical order, yet certain transitions between exchanges felt fractionally incomplete, as if a stabilizing element in the environment had been removed. Without altering the physical structure of the space, Daniel Hayes, reviewing live system integrity logs and hierarchical awareness calibration metrics, recorded a previously unclassified anomaly. Emotional feedback loops within packball social dynamics were showing degradation in continuity response patterns, despite all physical attendance metrics remaining fully compliant, and despite no identifiable procedural disruption within ceremonial structure. Emma Collins, however, remained entirely outside all recognition systems. Her presence no longer indexed, no longer processed, no longer even interpreted as absence, resulting in a condition where the environment no longer contained any operational reference to her existence, effectively removing her from the cognitive architecture of the pack, while leaving physical reality unchanged. Grayson Whitmore paused briefly during a transition and strategic discussion, and although there was no conscious awareness of its cause, the pause extended fractionally longer than necessary, as if the flow of structured thought had encountered an imperceptible gap in continuity that could not be attributed to any visible or logical source. He resumed immediately, but the residual disruption remained unclassified within his awareness, manifesting only as a subtle sense that something essential to the rhythm of the hall was no longer reinforcing itself as it once had. Emma Collins remained still, unchanged, unacknowledged, yet her absence was no longer a simple void within recognition systems, because it had begun to function as an active disruption within the emotional continuity of the pack itself, altering the internal coherence of interactions without being directly perceived. Across the hall, conversations continued, but the transitions between them now carried a faint lack of resonance, as if responses were arriving without the emotional reinforcement that once naturally accompanied them. Daniel Hayes escalated the anomaly classification to high-priority systemic emotional degradation, noting that while no individual subject appeared affected in isolation, the collective interaction structure of the pack ball environment was exhibiting measurable loss of continuity stability directly correlated with the absence of a single omega presence that could no longer be indexed by any operational system. Grayson Whitmore, still unaware of the origin, experienced another brief interruption in his internal flow of assessment, not enough to identify, but sufficient to create an unfamiliar structural emptiness in the rhythm of the gathering around him. And within that subtle discontinuity, the pack ball continued its ceremony in perfect physical order while silently losing coherence in a way that no system could yet fully explain, because the world had not simply stopped seeing Emma Collins. It had begun to lose something far more fundamental in the process of no longer being able to notice her at all. The 11th packball unfolded under the same architectural perfection that had defined every Whitmore territory gathering. Yet the structural stability of the event had now entered a critical phase of perceptual degradation that no longer remained confined to isolated emotional inconsistencies, but had expanded into a measurable disruption of continuity across the entire social framework. Crystal chandeliers still cast controlled golden light across the vast marble hall, and orchestral arrangements still guided the formal rhythm of conversation among alpha families and territorial delegates. But within this unchanged external structure, the internal coherence of interaction had begun to fracture in ways that were no longer subtle or easily dismissed as variants within ceremonial flow. Emma Collins no longer existed within any recognition system, not as presence, not as absence, not even as a conceptual reference point within the pack's cognitive architecture. Yet the space she occupied continued to exert a silent pressure on the environment, as if the system itself was attempting to resolve a missing variable it could no longer identify. She stood at the same outer boundary of the hall, unchanged in posture, unchanged in composure, but entirely disconnected from every perceptual layer that once failed to acknowledge her, creating a condition where her existence no longer interacted with reality. Through any measurable interface of awareness, Grayson Whitmore moved through the central chamber with composed authority, engaged in structured governance dialogue and alliance continuity management. Yet for the first time, his internal processing of the environment encountered subtle interruptions in narrative cohesion, moments where conversational transitions felt fractionally misaligned with expected continuity, though no external trigger or identifiable source could be located within. Active perception. Daniel Hayes. Monitoring live system integrity and hierarchical awareness calibration metrics, recorded a significant escalation in systemic instability, noting that while physical attendance and ceremonial compliance remained fully intact, emotional continuity mapping across pack-ball interactions had entered a state of progressive fragmentation, with response loops failing to stabilize around previously consistent social reference points. Emma Collins remained completely outside all operational indexing. Yet her removal from perceptual systems had not resulted in neutral stability, but instead in an expanding void effect within interaction networks, where conversational flow, attention distribution, and hierarchical reinforcement patterns began to lose synchronization without any direct awareness of causation. Grayson Whitmore paused during a structured exchange with a territorial delegate, the interruption lasting longer than prior cycles, not due to conscious awareness of anomaly, but due to a subtle degradation in cognitive flow continuity that left a brief gap between intention and articulation, a disruption that resolved itself but left behind no identifiable explanation within his reasoning framework. Across the hall, conversations continued in formal structure, yet increasingly, transitions between exchanges felt less anchored, as if responses were occurring without the emotional reinforcement that once provided seamless cohesion within the pack's social rhythm. Daniel Hayes' escalated system alerts to maximum priority under emotional stability protocols, reporting that the pack-ball environment was now exhibiting signs of distributed coherence. Failure, where no single node appeared malfunctioning, yet the collective system was losing its ability to maintain unified interaction logic. Emma Collins, though physically present within the hall, remained entirely unregistered, her existence no longer processed by any cognitive layer. Yet paradoxically, her absence was now functioning as an active destabilizing factor within the system, producing measurable degradation in social synchronization despite no detectable source of interference. Grayson Whitmore experienced another brief interruption in internal narrative continuity, a sensation of structural incompleteness within the flow of governance processing, as though an essential contextual anchor was missing from the environment, yet still without any conscious identification of its origin. The pack-ball continued its ceremonial progression with unchanged physical precision. Music maintaining structured cadence, conversations flowing across hierarchical tiers, yet within this continuity, the emotional and perceptual coherence of the system continued to deteriorate in expanding waves of instability, revealing that what had once been dismissed as the absence of a single omega presence had evolved into a systemic failure of recognition itself, where the world no longer merely failed to see her, but was beginning to lose its ability to maintain stable reality around the space where she once existed. The 12th pack-ball unfolded under the same grand architectural design that had defined every Whitmore territory gathering. Yet the structural integrity of the event had now reached a critical threshold where perceptual coherence across the entire social system was no longer stable, as if the absence of a single unindexed presence had expanded into a systemic distortion affecting every layer of interaction within the hall. Crystal chandeliers still illuminated the vast marble interior with controlled golden radiance, and orchestral arrangements still guided the formal cadence of conversation among alpha families and territorial delegates. But within this unchanged physical structure, the cognitive and emotional synchronization of the pack had begun to fragment in a way that no operational system could fully stabilize or interpret. Emma Collins remained physically present at the outer boundary of the hall, unchanged in posture and composure, yet now entirely beyond all recognition systems, not as an overlooked individual, not as an ignored presence, but as a complete absence within perception architecture, where even the concept of her existence no longer triggered any cognitive reference point within the pack's awareness framework. Grayson Whitmore moved through the central chamber with composed authority, engaged in structured governance dialogue and alliance continuity management. Yet his internal processing now exhibited repeated micro-disruptions in continuity mapping, moments where conversational flow and environmental interpretation briefly failed to align before self-correcting without identifiable cause, creating a subtle but persistent degradation in perception stability that remained unclassified within standard cognitive frameworks. Daniel Hayes, monitoring live system integrity and hierarchical awareness calibration metrics, reported a full-scale systemic coherence failure across emotional continuity networks, where pack-ball interaction models no longer maintain synchronized response behavior despite all physical and procedural parameters remaining within expected operational limits, indicating a decoupling between environmental structure and perceptual reinforcement systems. Emma Collins, though physically present, no longer existed within any operational indexing layer. Yet her absence had evolved into an active destabilizing factor within the system, producing measurable disruption in interaction coherence, attentional flow distribution, and hierarchical response sequencing across all active participants without any identifiable causal trigger. Across the hall, conversations continued in structured formal rhythm, yet transitions between exchanges now carried increasing discontinuity, as if responses were no longer anchored to a stable emotional or cognitive framework, resulting in fragmented interaction loops that no longer reinforced collective coherence within the pack's social architecture. Grayson Whitmore paused again during a strategic exchange, the interruption lasting longer than prior cycles, not due to conscious awareness of anomaly, but due to a deeper structural inconsistency within his internal processing flow, where the absence of a previously unacknowledged reference point created a momentary gap in narrative continuity that resolved itself without explanation but left behind persistent instability in interpretive alignment. Daniel Hayes escalated system wide alerts to maximum critical priority, reporting that the pack-ball environment was now exhibiting complete breakdown of distributed emotional coherence, where no individual subsystem appeared malfunctioning. Yet the collective interaction network had lost its ability to maintain unified perceptual stability, indicating a failure not of structure, but of recognition architecture itself. Emma Collins remained still at the outer boundary of the hall, her physical presence unchanged, yet now functioning as a zero reference point within the system, where neither presence nor absence could be processed, and where all recognition pathways terminated without resolution. Grayson Whitmore experienced another interruption in cognitive flow, this time more pronounced, a structural silence between thoughts that could not be attributed to distraction or fatigue, but which nevertheless resolved without identification, leaving behind an increasingly unfamiliar sense of incomplete environmental awareness. The pack-ball continued its ceremonial progression with unchanged physical precision, music maintaining structured cadence, conversations flowing across hierarchical tiers. Yet within this continuity, the entire system of social, emotional, and perceptual coherence had entered a state of progressive collapse, revealing that what began as the absence of recognition had evolved into a full systemic failure of reality stabilization, where the world no longer simply failed to see Emma Collins, but could no longer maintain consistent perception of anything around the space where she once existed. The 13th pack-ball unfolded under the same monumental architecture of the Whitmore Territory Hall, yet nothing within the environment remained truly stable in the way it had been understood across all previous cycles, as if the entire perceptual foundation of the gathering had reached a final threshold where recognition itself could no longer maintain structural continuity. Crystal chandeliers still suspended above the marble expanse, casting controlled golden illumination across the ceremonial space, and orchestral music still attempted to guide the rhythm of conversation among alpha families and territorial delegates. But every layer of that carefully maintained order now existed without a stable reference point to anchor collective awareness, creating a quiet systemic collapse beneath the surface of formal perfection. Emma Collins stood at the outer boundary of the hall, unchanged in physical posture, unchanged in presence, yet now entirely beyond any functioning recognition architecture, not as absence, not as invisibility, but as something more absolute, where even the system's capacity to define her existence had fully dissolved, leaving no perceptual pathway capable of reconstructing her within cognitive or social frameworks. Grayson Whitmore moved through the central chamber with composed authority, engaged in structured governance dialogue and alliance continuity management. Yet for the first time, his internal processing no longer maintained stable continuity across environmental interpretation, as subtle but irreversible gaps formed between perception and understanding, creating moments where conversational flow, spatial awareness, and cognitive sequencing failed to align, not as errors, but as missing structural elements that could not be located within any known reference system. Daniel Hayes, monitoring full system integrity and hierarchical awareness calibration from the secondary observation interface, recorded complete collapse of emotional continuity mapping across the packball environment, where all interaction networks had ceased to generate coherent response synchronization despite physical systems remaining fully operational, indicating a total decoupling between environmental structure and perceptual cognition at a systemic level. Emma Collins, though physically present within the hall, no longer existed within any indexed layer of reality processing, yet her absence had become the central destabilizing force of the entire system, not through action or interference, but through the complete removal of recognition continuity, creating a condition where perception itself could no longer maintain consistent reference alignment across the pack's collective awareness structure. Across the hall, conversations continued in fragmented form, yet no exchange maintained full continuity, as if meaning itself was dissolving between sentences, leaving interactions structurally intact but cognitively incomplete, producing a gradual collapse of shared understanding across all hierarchical tiers. Grayson Whitmore paused in the center of the hall during a governance exchange, and this time the pause did not resolve cleanly, as internal cognitive flow failed to reconstruct the expected sequence of awareness, leaving a widening structural silence between perception and interpretation, not emotional, not conscious, but systemic, as if the framework supporting recognition of reality had lost a foundational element that could no longer be compensated for through reasoning or memory. Daniel Hayes escalated final system integrity alerts, reporting complete failure of distributed perceptual coherence across all packball interaction models, confirming that no individual subsystem was malfunctioning independently, but rather the entire structure of recognition itself had collapsed into non-continuity, where reality could still be observed but no longer consistently interpreted. Emma Collins remained at the boundary of the hall, unmoving, unchanged, yet now functioning as the final null reference point within a system that could no longer process her existence in any form, causing all perceptual pathways attempting to reference her to terminate without resolution, effectively breaking the continuity of awareness across the entire environment. Grayson Whitmore experienced one final and irreversible breakdown in cognitive alignment, where the concept of presence itself fractured into incomplete segments that no longer resolved into meaning, leaving him standing in a hall that still existed visually, still functioned structurally, yet no longer maintained coherent reality beneath perception. The packball continued in absolute physical precision, music still playing, chandeliers still shining, voices still forming structured sound, but none of it held unified meaning anymore, as the entire system of recognition, hierarchy, and social awareness had collapsed around a single unindexed existence, revealing the final truth that she had not been ignored, forgotten, or overlooked, but had become the point at which the world itself lost the ability to see, process, or sustain continuity of reality.